we're going to work with a little known Angular state manager. Another state manager? Don't we already have NGRX? Well, yes, we do, but this state manager has built-in form support. Well, that also means it has validations. And you don't need NGRX. Well, it's actually just Angular Forms. Now, there's a lot of similarities between stores and forms. They both deal with storage and retrieval of data, and both have built-in reactivity. With NGRX stores, you have selectors. With forms, we have value changes. And if you hide the form implementation, this looks awfully like a store. But we won't be talking about NGRX today, so let's head back to our form implementation. With our profile form, which contains name and quote and my favorite game, and a second form group, which is an array of projects that I have ongoing. This will be the basis of our exercise today. We'll look at how to display these forms on the page and how to work with the form API. Back in our app component, the form group being created doesn't mean we need to consume it right away on the HTML. We only need to wrap the router outlet with our form and add the form group binding. What this allows us to do is gain access to the control container API further down in our component tree. In our profile component, the control container works by context. I'll explain that one in a little bit. But first, to gain access to our form, you need to do a control container.control. And this will retrieve the reference to our parent form by context. Next, we reach into the parent form and grab our profile group. And lastly, the name form control can then be retrieved from the profile form. But what about the quote control? Don't we need that as well? Well, let's just hold off on that and we'll see how the HTML looks. Over on the template, the first thing we're going to do is bind to our profile form group. The next item is the name control. This version is using the form control name binding. So what this does is it uses the context of the profile group to retrieve the name form control that is in this profile group. You can do it two ways. So the first way is via this form control name. The second way is through the explicit passing of the form control. So this name variable is the one that we declared in our component, and we're binding the control that was retrieved in the model to the binding. So with those two methods in mind, we can just retrieve the form control via context, and that's why I left out the quote control in the component model. And we'll discuss how and why you would choose to use these two methods. I want to make a quick note here about the form group binding. You see that we have a form control name. There's also a form group name. So if you want to bind to the form group via context, that is also available. And there are going to be situations where that might be useful. Just a little back and forth to see the two in action. On the project template, we're binding to the global form at the very top. And this is required so that we can gain access to the form array name via context. And this lets us loop over the form controls in the project's array. The let I equals index at the end there lets us use the form index as the form group name. And this will then let us gain access to the child form controls also via context. That's quite a mouthful. Let's take a break from all the code. Here on the profile page, we have both the name and quote controls rendered out. The name control is rendered out twice, the first using form control name and the second with form control. Over on the projects page, there were 2 projects in that form array, and both were rendered out using the ngFor. And lastly, there is a review page that goes over all of the changes that you have made so far. If I were to update a value on this page, going next takes me back to the profile page, and you can see that our value has indeed been updated. And it does not matter which input box you choose to update, because they are binding to the same control at the end of the day, it is going to update that value in the global form. And that's a little demonstration of how the app is supposed to behave. One of the newer features of Angular 14 is typed forms. You may have noticed earlier that I was using untyped form groups and untyped form controls. That's sort of like using type any for your variables, and that's not good practice. What you want to do is provide types to these form controls so that when you are accessing them, the form control will be type aware. Further down, you can see that when I am constructing the forms, I provide the form type, and now that this form group is type aware, if I try to construct this form control with an incompatible type, the form group will now complain about that incompatible type. If you look at where I am constructing the form group, this is now in a form service, and this will help mitigate some of the boilerplate that we have to write in our components when we want to reuse these form controls. So with the form service in place, we can now revisit our profile component and refactor the control container out. I'm going to import the form service. And update our reference. Now this untyped form group is not required anymore. We have types, and as you can see, you don't have to import the form type at all. It just understands that this form, because it is already typed from the service. Unfortunately, the types are lost when we use this get. Is there another way we can do this? Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Okay, so we don't need to use this form.get anymore. We can directly access the controls.profile. Because we have the types available, TypeScript will be happy with this, and we don't have to mess around with string getters. And we'll do the same thing for our name form control. And that's beautiful. It's all typed, and we don't have to guess at what it's supposed to be typed as. We've created the component for displaying the individual projects. So let's start consuming it. Pretty much all of this can now go away since it's already in our individual project component. And the great thing about the new components is they can specify required properties. So this one is for project, and that's taking the group prop. And I also want to pass the index because we wanted to display which project was being rendered at the time. All right. Since we are explicitly passing the controls now, we don't need the context anymore. That cleans up our template a little bit. And that also means we don't need this anymore either, because we are not using the context. None of that is required. And well, it used to be the entire screen, but now it's only 6 lines of code. We went over some of the differences between form control name and form controls. Now, there's one aspect we haven't touched yet, which is form validations. So with form control name, you're only providing a string to the form control name, and this string does not have access to your form errors. If you were to do any sort of validation, this method is not going to work for us. So with this refactor, I'm going to get rid of all of the references to form control name. All right, and because we are no longer using form control name, we don't have to have this form group binding at the top of the page either. All right, and to add the form errors, just gonna drop a ngIf. And this one always gets me. This needs to be all lowercase. I'm just going to copy this down here. This is supposed to be 8 characters. And that's our completed implementation with form validation. All right, so to cap it all off, if you haven't upgraded your forms yet, it's time to do so. It can do so much more now with typed forms. And if you put that form in a service, it can simplify a lot of your architecture and not be a source of pain.